Go to another news story now, which is about how much those at the top are being paid in comparison to those at the bottom. The High Pay Centre, they've done some research that finds that the median FTSE 100 CEO pay has increased from 3.38 million in 2021 to 3.91 million in 2022. Median CEO pay is now 118 times that of the median UK full-time worker. And that's gone up from 108 times in 2021 and 79 times in 2020. We were discussing this just before the break and how much those at the top are being paid in comparison to those at the bottom. And whether this mushrooming amount, these multiples of many, is a good thing for society, whether we should be regulating it more. How could we regulate it? Is that just getting a bit too socialist if we try to? Well, who better to discuss this with than the head of communications for High Pay Centre, who wrote this report, Andrew Speke. Andrew, thank you for being on the show today. Just give us a general synopsis of the research that you've done and what you have found.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on, Alex. So in terms of a general synopsis, we found that for the median CEO in the FTSE 100, so that's the 100 biggest companies on the London Stock Exchange, their pay has increased £500,000 in the past year. So now the ratio of CEO to a typical UK worker is 118 to 1. A year ago it was 108 to 1. Actually, the year before that it was 78 to 1. So we've seen a really big bounce back in sort of CEO pay since the pandemic ended. So since the pandemic, we've seen CEO pay bounce back. Worker pay, on the other hand, has not been keeping up with inflation. So we're seeing a real sort of disconnect here between the fortunes of workers and those at the very top. Those at the very top seem to be immune from these calls for pay restraint, whereas others are suffering as a consequence.
I mean, can you contextualise this and explain to me what's happened rather than just in the last sort of decade or so, but over the course of around 50 years? Because my understanding is the last time we had such high levels of inflation in the 1970s, that wage gap was far, far smaller, perhaps even a third of what it is today.
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. So, and I think that actually is the bigger picture of why we came into existence, because, you go back to 1970s, early 1980s, I think you're looking at gaps of 30 to 40 to 1, perhaps even less. And then we go through into the 2000s, this period of liberalisation of the economy, this period of financialisation, and we've started to see then CEO pay compared to worker pay get up into the 100 to 1 plus, which is why we came into existence 11 years ago. And actually, we saw in the coalition government a number of policies to try and start to curb this trend. And we have in general seen a little bit of a flattening out in the last decade. But as we can see in the last few years, we've started to see it go back up again in a way that hasn't happened for workers.
I mean, the difficulty is how you control it. And I think this is where you and I, because I have full sympathies with the research you've done and what you're trying to do. I really, really do. But how one would handle this might be where we begin to diverge, because some might argue that if you start preventing people or putting caps on the salaries of chief execs, and you're actually putting a dampener on business and industry that will drive people out of this country or drive investment out. And it almost has a negative effect when we're not taxing these big salaries and creaming off half of what they're being paid from the private sector and putting it in our coffers of the nation.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of points there. I think one thing that's worth noting is that UK, the gap between CEOs and worker pay is much higher than many countries in Europe. And there are many countries in Europe where they're doing better economically, not all countries. And I think another point which comes along with that is that in terms of tax, well, the whole point is you can have a different pay structure where workers are being paid more, bosses are being paid a bit less. That can still lead to the same tax outcome. And then I think one thing that we'd say is, does having one person at the top, often one man at the top, and lots of people, the vast majority of employees being rewarded far less. Does that really motivate people? Does that really encourage productivity? Does that really make people feel that they're part of the mission of that company? And I think that's something which can actually lead to companies being less successful, therefore less money going to the economy and less tax. So I think there are different ways of looking at this.
But how would we actually do this? Because this is where it gets very difficult, because you end up with the states dictating what should happen in business and industry, which, people have very different views on how politics should work. But I often have been a supporter of the idea that the state regulating too much is bad for industry. But I do believe that capitalism should have a conscience. So what sort of tools and structures could we put in place to actually try and close that wealth gap and make sure that you haven't got a situation where the highest of earners are laughing their way to the bank, whereas the ordinary person can't put on their central heating?
Yeah, I think if you look in general at our research and our policy proposals in this report, but in other reports, we tend to be fairly open-minded. We don't say there's a fixed kind of sort of pay ratio maximum that there necessarily has to be. But two things I think which we think are very important are ensuring that trade unions are able to access workplaces, that all workers are able to access a trade union. And I think that's a really big trend, is that lower trade union density in recent decades. The lower the trade union density has gone, the higher these ratios have gone up. So I think that's trade unions are a core part of a free society. I think on the other hand, we've also seen, we need a kind of stakeholder version of capitalism. Like at the moment, UK law encourages companies to prioritize shareholders above consumers, above workers, above the environment. And I think we would say that there needs to be a more balanced approach. So, changing company law in order to enable that. I think those modest changes, were actually in the manifestos of Labour and the Liberal Democrats of the last election, would play a significant role in starting to change this.
It's an interesting one, and do you know what? I want to hear what you at home think on this, because I don't know whether, like me, you think capitalism does need to start growing a conscience, but whether also, like me, you sort of shrink back a little bit from the idea of putting in, giving unions far more power and putting into place almost sort of, socialist structures when it comes to the distribution of wealth. But surely something needs to be done. What is it? Have you got a bright idea? Call me 0344 499 1000 or text me your thoughts, talk plus your message to 87222. Andrew, it's interesting, isn't it? You said earlier, before we went on to the sort of tools you might put in place, that Britain is one of the worst offenders when it comes to this wealth gap compared to other countries, those on the continent perhaps. Why is that? What is it that they're doing that we're not doing, which means that there isn't this massive divide between the haves and the have-nots?
Yeah, I think there are two aspects. Obviously, I've already touched on trade union rights, and I think that's an important one. And in the UK, we did see the eroding of trade union rights, particularly in the Thatcher era, and we've not seen that restored since. I think that's a big one. I think another thing is also the composition of the UK economy. And obviously, the financial sector is a big one, and that has a big impact on this inequality. Whereas I think in other countries, there's a kind of wider spread of different industries. And I think it is worth noting in terms of that is what we saw. There was a really interesting FT piece earlier this year, Financial Times piece, which showed that actually the top decile, the top sort of 10% of Brits do quite well compared to other Europeans. In terms of our medium and sort of middle and lower income workers, we're comparable to countries in who used to be part of some of them who used to be part of the Eastern Bloc, who've obviously had a much more difficult path. So I do think it is something about saying that we need pay a bit more equal in companies to make people feel that they're part of the companies that they're working for, and to really inspire greater productivity.
Andrew, it's been fascinating speaking to you, and I totally agree with the sort of research your think tank is doing. I do think we have a problem in this country. I still don't think I'm very clear on quite how we're going to solve it, though. That's Andrew Speke, who's Head of Communications for the High Pay Centre. What would you do to make sure that shareholders and CEOs aren't pocketing millions while the rest of us don't see our wages rise at all, especially when we're in a cost of living crisis, and the amount it costs just to put on the heating, buy your bits and bobs at the supermarket, ticket, get on a bus or a train, fill your tank of petrol. It's all going up, isn't it? And it does seem to me that there is something fundamentally wrong. But I'm afraid I don't have solutions to the problem. And thankfully, I don't have my hands on the levers of power either. But give me your thoughts. 03444991000. That's the number to call. On that note, let us talk.